Hey everyone, I'm Kim and welcome back to Crime Stats Daily. This is a channel where we go beyond the headlines to examine the facts, the statistics, and the stories behind crime in America. Our goal is simple: to separate myth from reality using reliable data and credible research. If you enjoy fact-based crime analysis, please hit that subscribe button. Join me here each week as we delve into the numbers. Now let's get started. Now, when most people hear the word serial killer, the image that probably comes to mind is a man, and statistically, that makes sense. Women represent a relatively small percentage of identified serial killers, but female serial killers do exist, and research has found that they often differ from male serial killers in some important ways. So today, we're going beyond the famous cases. We're going to look at what the research tells us about female serial killers, how those patterns compare with male offenders, and most importantly, whether what researchers found decades ago still holds up when we look at newer research in more recent cases. Because there is an important problem with studying serial murder. The numbers aren't as simple as they might appear. So let's start with the definition. The FBI's 2008 Serial Murder Symposium defined serial murder as the unlawful killing of two or more victims by the same offender or offenders in separate events. There's an important distinction here. A cooling off period is often associated with the popular definition of serial murder. But the FBI's working definition does not require a specific cooling off period. The important distinction is that the killing occurred in separate events. That definition matters because different studies and databases can use somewhat different criteria. When we're comparing statistics, we need to know what is actually being counted. So throughout this episode, we're going to be careful about the difference between identified cases, research samples, and current estimates. So how common are female serial killers? According to the Radford FGCU Serial Killer Database, and yes, there's a database, women account for approximately 11% of identified serial killers overall, with the U.S. figure at approximately 8.6%. So roughly speaking, that's about 1 out of every 12 identified serial killers in the U.S. in that database. There's another part of the story that's even more interesting. The percentage has changed considerably over time. In the earliest historical periods represented in the database, women accounted for a much larger share of identified serial killers. Before the 1930s, women represented roughly a third or more of identified serial killers in several periods. That percentage then dropped dramatically. In the United States, women represented about 5% of identified serial killers in the 1990s. That increased to about 7% in the 2000s and nearly 8% in the 2010s. So the trend isn't simply a straight line downward. That's why looking at the historical numbers matters. There's another problem. The most recent years are incomplete. We don't have a reliable national census telling us exactly how many female serial killers there are in 2026. So we're going to use the strongest available research rather than pretend the data is more complete than, of course, it actually is. Now, one of the most important studies of female serial killers was published by Marissa Harrison and colleagues in 2015. The researcher examined 64 female serial killers in the United States whose crimes occurred between the years 1821 and 2008. That study found several reoccurring patterns. The most common method of killing was poisoning. The most common motive category was financial gain. The women in the study generally knew all or most of their victims and most were related to at least one victim. The researchers also found that caregiving roles were common. Every offender in their sample had targeted at least one victim who was a child, who was an elderly victim, or who was sick. And these findings challenged the popular image of serial killer as a stranger hunting strangers. There's something we need to remember. The study ended in 2008. So that brings us to the question that matters for this episode. What happened after 2008? Now, the 2008 cutoff doesn't mean the research stopped. It means we need to build on that earlier research. Harrison continued studying female serial killers, and in 2023, she published Just as Deadly, which examined female serial killers and compared their characteristics and behaviors with male serial killers. The Radford FGCU database has also continued to expand. Its 2023 report provides data extending into the 2010s and the beginning of the 2020s. That's important because the newer research gives us an opportunity to ask whether the patterns identified in the older research have changed. We need to be honest about the limits. The 2020s data in the Radford database is incomplete. So I'm not going to tell you that we have a definitive 2026 percentage. We don't. What we can do is examine the newer research in more recent documented cases and see whether the major patterns continue to appear. When we do that, the answer is interesting. The newer research does not completely overturn the earlier findings. Several of the major patterns remain. Harrison's later work reports that more than 90% of female serial killers in the research killed at least one person they knew. More than 60% were related to at least one victim. More than 3/4 killed someone who was vulnerable and in their care, and more than half killed children. Poisoning also remains the most common method identified in Harrison's research. So while individual cases can be very different, the broad pattern has remained surprisingly consistent. Now, I want to emphasize something. These are patterns, not rules. Statistics describe groups. They don't tell us what an individual offender must look like. Some of the most famous female serial killer cases demonstrate exactly why that's important. So let's take a look. We'll look at two historical cases here. Jane Toppan was a Massachusetts nurse who murdered patients and other people around the turn of the 20th century. She confessed to numerous killings, and although the exact number of her victims remain uncertain, her case illustrates several patterns found in the research: a caregiving role, access to vulnerable people, and poisoning. And then there's the Nannie Doss case. Doss killed members of her family and several husbands over a period of decades. Poison was again the primary method. Her case also illustrates the importance of relationships and access. These weren't random strangers encountered on the street. They were people within the offender's personal or caregiving environments. That is one of the most consistent differences researchers have identified between female and male serial killers. Now let's look at two more cases that show why we can't treat those patterns as a checklist. Dorothea Puente operated a boarding house in Sacramento, California during the 1980s. Her tenants included elderly and vulnerable people. She was charged with 9 murders, but convicted of 3. And her case illustrates how access, trust, vulnerable victims, and financial exploitation can intersect. And then we have Aileen Wuornos. She is of particular importance because she doesn't fit the typical female pattern nearly as well. Between 1989 and 1990, she killed 7 men in Florida. Her victims were all strangers, and firearms were her method. She was convicted of 6 murders, and she was executed in 2002. Wuornos demonstrates why averages can be useful without being absolute. If investigators looked only for the typical female serial killer pattern, someone like Wuornos could easily be overlooked. So now let's put the research together. Female and male serial killers obviously have something fundamentally in common. They are both committing serial murder. Researchers have identified meaningful differences in the patterns, and female serial killers are much more likely to have victims they know. Vulnerable people and people within their care are particularly prominent in the research. Poisoning is disproportionately common among female serial killers. Financial gain is a particularly important motive category. Male serial killers are more likely to have stranger victims, and comparative research has found greater representation of sexual power and thrill-related motivations among male offenders. There is considerable overlap. That's important. There isn't a single female serial killer profile. There isn't a single female male serial killer profile. What we're seeing are statistical differences between groups. Those differences can help us understand cases. They can't replace evidence. So what does the evidence tell us? Well, first, serial killers are rare. The Radford FGCU database puts women at approximately 11% of identified serial killers overall and about 8.6% in the United States. Second, the proportion has changed over time. Women represented a much larger share of identified serial killers in some of the earliest historical periods, followed by a substantial decline during the 20th century. Third, the major patterns identified in earlier research haven't simply disappeared. Known victims, vulnerable victims, caregiving relationships, poisoning, financial motives, many of those patterns continue to appear in later research. But the cases of women such as Aileen Wuornos remind us that patterns aren't rules, and there's one final limitation we need to keep in mind. There is no perfect real-time national database of female serial killers. The most useful databases are continually updated. Definitions can differ, and recent years are incomplete. So when you hear a statistic about serial killers, don't just ask what's the number, ask where did that number come from? What years does it cover? How was serial murder defined? And most importantly, what does the evidence actually support? That's the difference between simply repeating a crime statistic and understanding it. Female serial killers are rare, but they are not random. And the research shows that while individual cases vary dramatically, some patterns have remained remarkably consistent over time. Now, tomorrow or the next day, I'm going to report on some turn-of-the-century female serial killers and how that impacted crime forensics moving into the future. That's the data for today. Stay informed, stay aware, and more importantly, stay safe out there. And I'll see you in the next one.